These are 4,963 Canadian soldiers who crossed the English Channel on the night of August 18, 1942, to capture a French port town and hold it for a single tide. By mid-morning the next day, more than 2 out of every 3 of them were dead, wounded, or prisoners of the German army. This is the story of Operation Jubilee, the Dieppe raid, and a controversy that has outlived nearly every man who survived it, the question of who exactly gave the final order to send them ashore. In under 6 hours of actual fighting, Canada suffered what's still remembered as the bloodiest single day in its military history. There's a strange irony in that. Dieppe had historically been one of the French ports that sent ships to New France, the colony that eventually became Canada. That same town became, in 6 hours, the place that took more Canadian lives than any other single day of fighting in either World War. The raid would go on to shape amphibious doctrine, Allied intelligence practice, prisoner of war policy, and even the specialized tanks that eventually rolled onto the beaches of Normandy. Before any of that, Dieppe was just a port nobody in Berlin expected anyone to attack. By the summer of 1942, the war looked close to lost for the Allies. German forces were driving deep into the Soviet Union toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields, while the British Eighth Army had been pushed back into Egypt. Joseph Stalin was demanding, repeatedly and bluntly, that Britain and the United States open a second front in France. His goal was to force the German military to pull at least 40 divisions off the Eastern Front and relieve pressure on the Red Army before it broke entirely. A full cross-channel invasion was years away from being possible, and everyone in the Allied High Command knew it. At the Second Washington Conference in June 1942, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill postponed any direct assault on occupied France and committed instead to Operation Torch, the landings in North Africa. The United States, still operating under its Germany First strategy, wanted some kind of continental foothold established even so, and that left Stalin without the second front he kept demanding. It also left a Canadian army that had spent nearly 2 years training and drilling in England without seeing a single day of combat. Mackenzie King, Canada's Prime Minister, and his senior generals wanted those soldiers in a fight, not stuck on garrison duty indefinitely. The decision to commit them finally ran up through Canada's own chain of command, through General Andrew McNaughton, who led 1st Canadian Army, and Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, who commanded I Canadian Corps. There was a third pressure building inside the Royal Air Force, separate from anything happening on the Eastern Front or in Ottawa. Fighter Command wanted a reason to draw the Luftwaffe into a large air battle over French soil, on terms favorable to British fighters operating close to their own bases with full fuel tanks. A raid on the French coast would do exactly that, and Dieppe would eventually deliver that air battle at a cost nobody in the RAF had fully reckoned with in advance. On March 4, 1942, the Allies appointed Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten Chief of Combined Operations, a headquarters first established after the disaster at Dunkirk in 1940 to plan small-scale raids against occupied Europe while the Allies rebuilt toward a full invasion. Mountbatten would become the single most consistent sponsor of the raid that followed, and also the central, unresolved question of his own career. Dieppe itself had almost no strategic value of its own. What it had was geography. The port sat close enough to England that Royal Air Force fighters based on the English coast could give continuous cover for the entire length of a raid, out and back, without running low on fuel deep over hostile territory. Combined Operations Headquarters, under Mountbatten, set specific and limited objectives for the raid. Planners wanted the port seized and held for roughly one tidal cycle, partly to test directly whether a heavily defended port could be captured at all by frontal assault. Beyond that, the objectives ran long: gather intelligence and prisoners, destroy coastal defenses and port infrastructure, knock out a German radar station and a nearby airfield, raid a German divisional headquarters inland, then withdraw before German reinforcements could arrive in force from further along the coast. In part, it was meant as a controlled experiment, proof of concept for the eventual full-scale invasion of Europe that everyone already understood was still years away but would have to be planned for eventually, regardless of how badly the war was going in the meantime. Planners first launched this idea under the codename Operation Rudder, scheduled for July 7, 1942. The Chiefs of Staff had formally endorsed the underlying plan on May 11, and by around May 20 the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division had begun dedicated amphibious training on the Isle of Wight, rehearsing beach landings against mocked-up defenses for weeks before anyone knew the actual target. Paratroopers and a heavy preliminary bombing raid were part of that original rudder plan, meant to soften German defenses before any infantry came ashore. Rear Admiral Harold Bailey Groman was initially named Naval Force Commander for the operation, but doubts about whether rudder was actually feasible cost him the job, and Captain John Hughes Hallett took over, the officer who would go on to become the raid's principal architect. Bad weather forced a postponement of rudder in early July, and a German fighter-bomber attack struck the assembled troopships soon after, still loaded with soldiers waiting in English harbors for the weather to clear. That combination scrapped rudder entirely, the whole plan called off after weeks of training and assembly. What happened next is where the disaster actually begins. Weeks later, planners revived the raid under a new code name, Jubilee, with commandos replacing the paratroopers from the original plan, and the time troops would spend ashore cut from 2 tides down to 1. Debate over the preliminary heavy bombing dragged through early June and early July of 1942, and commanders cancelled it outright, worried it would kill French civilians in the town and bury the beach exits under rubble the tanks would never climb over. Mountbatten requested battleship and cruiser gunfire support for the landing, the kind of heavy naval bombardment that could actually suppress German artillery positioned on high ground above the beaches. The Admiralty refused, unwilling to risk capital ships that close to the French coast and within range of German shore batteries and Luftwaffe airfields just minutes away. What the assault force actually got was 8 destroyers armed with nothing heavier than 4-inch guns, far too light to silence artillery dug into the headlands on either side of the town. An intelligence failure compounded everything else. A combined operations briefing dated April 25, 1942, told planners that Dieppe was held by roughly 1,500 men of the German 110th Division, with its headquarters supposedly at Arques-la-Bataille. In reality, that division had left the area back in April of 1941, more than a year earlier, quietly replaced by the 302nd Static Infantry Division, which put total German strength across the wider Dieppe sector closer to 6,000 men, with the divisional headquarters now relocated to Envermeu. Nobody updated the briefing before the raid launched. Rail-mounted artillery the Germans had bored directly into tunnels inside the headland cliffs, work carried out by the organization TOT, went completely undetected by Allied reconnaissance. The gradient of the beach itself mattered more than almost anything else, since it would decide whether tanks could even drive off the shoreline and into town. Planners assessed it largely from holiday snapshots tourists had taken before the war, not from any current reconnaissance of the ground the men would actually fight on. Air. Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory served as Air Force Commander for the operation, responsible for coordinating the fighter and bomber squadrons that would now be asked to compensate, from the air, for firepower the Royal Navy had refused to provide on the water. That detail about holiday photography has a modern echo that has nothing to do with the military at all. Today, open-source intelligence analysts deliberately scour public tourist photos, social media posts, and satellite imagery to map terrain and security details they could never obtain any other way. Back in 1942, that same method, relying on amateur holiday photography taken years before the war even started, worked almost by accident, and it left Allied planners with no real idea what kind of ground their men were actually about to fight and die on. 6,086 men would actually make it ashore by the time this assault force landed in August 1942, 4,963 Canadians from the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, roughly 1,000 British troops, 50 American Rangers, and 15 Free French commandos. Carrying them across the channel took 237 ships and landing craft, with close to 70 RAF and RCAF squadrons of fighters and bombers committed overhead. The Toronto Scottish rounded out the Canadian side, providing heavy weapons support to the infantry. The armor came from the Calgary Regiment, the 14th Canadian Army Tank Brigade. 58 Churchill tanks were loaded for the crossing, and only 29 of them made it ashore in the first wave. Just 15 ever crossed the seawall into the town itself, and every single one that landed was eventually lost. Waiting for them was the German 302nd Static Infantry Division, made up of infantry regiments 570, 571, and 572, backed by the division's own artillery, reconnaissance, anti-tank, engineer, and signal battalions. Overhead, the Luftwaffe could call on fighter wings JG-2 and JG-26, flying Focke-Wulf 190s, and bomber wings KG-2, KG-45, and KG-77, flying Dornier 217s. Command ran from Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander West, down through Generaloberst Kurt Haas's 15th Army and General der Panzertruppen Adolf Kunzen's LXXXI Corps, to General Lieutenant Konrad Haase, who commanded the 302nd Division on the ground at Dieppe itself. The plan called for landings on 6 beaches, codenamed in a line running west to east along the coastline: orange, green, white, red, blue, and yellow. On August 10, 1942, General Montgomery left England for North Africa, handing off his role in the operation just days before it finally launched. That same day, Generaloberst Kurt Haase issued a German warning order along the coast, a routine alert that had nothing specifically to do with Dieppe but that kept German units on a heightened footing regardless. On August 15, the entire 2nd Canadian Division was assembled and briefed under the cover story that they were heading out for nothing more than another large-scale training exercise. On the evening of August 18, 1942, the invasion fleet slipped out from 5 separate ports along England's south coast, running without lights into open water. For the soldiers crammed below decks, it felt like the same routine they had rehearsed for months on the Isle of Wight. This time, though, somewhere out in the dark ahead of them, an entire German division was waiting on the other side, exactly where Allied intelligence insisted it wasn't supposed to be in that strength. At roughly 3:48 the next morning, hours before any landing craft was due to touch sand, the eastern half of the convoy ran straight into a small German coastal convoy in the dark. The exchange of gunfire that followed did something no part of the plan had accounted for. It told the German garrison ashore that something was already moving toward them, well before dawn and well before the actual assault began. At the eastern end of the assault, near Berneval-le-Grand, that same convoy clash scattered most of No. 3 Commando, under Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford Slater, before it ever reached the beach intact. 1 single landing craft did get through, though. Lieutenant Henry Buckey, of the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, brought Major Peter Young and a party of roughly 20 men onto the beach below a 6-gun battery the British called the Goebbels Battery. Young's tiny force climbed a wired gully under fire, cut the battery's telephone lines, and from a wheat field about 200 yards away, started sniping the German gun crews, which kept the battery from firing effectively on the fleet offshore during the critical hours of the main landing further down the coast. Naval Force Commander Captain John Hughes Hallett later credited Young directly, writing that the battery's failure to engage the fleet effectively was largely due to Young's action. Historian Brereton Greenhouse has since tempered that legend somewhat, noting the battery still fired hundreds of rounds that morning, which makes its overall impact on the larger battle less clear-cut than Hughes Hallett's contemporary praise suggested. Both Young and Buckey earned the Distinguished Service Order for the action. A force smaller than a single platoon had just pulled off one of the only unambiguous tactical successes of the entire operation. At Puys, just east of Dieppe itself, the Royal Regiment of Canada and an attached company of the Black Watch landed against a German position the British called the Rommel Battery, on a narrow beach overlooked on both sides by high ground the Germans had had 2 years to fortify undisturbed. 227 men died there that morning, out of roughly 554 to 556 who had landed, with another 136 wounded and 264 taken prisoner. Only about 65 men made it back to England that same day. No Canadian infantry battalion suffered a heavier one-day loss anywhere in the entire Second World War, not even what the Royal Regiment of Canada would later face in Italy or Northwest Europe. The men commanding the operation from offshore, though, did not even know what had actually happened there. A garbled, falsely optimistic report reached Major General John Hamilton Roberts describing only light casualties at Puys, and that single piece of bad information, sitting uncorrected for hours, would help drive one of the worst decisions of the entire morning less than 2 hours afterward. At roughly 5:20 in the morning, the main assault hit the beaches directly in front of Dieppe itself. The Essex Scottish Regiment landed on Red Beach, the eastern half of the town front, while the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel Robert Labatt, landed alongside the Calgary Regiment's tanks on White Beach to the west just minutes later. Both units walked into a killing zone with almost no cover, pinned down on open shingle in front of a partly demolished casino on the seafront promenade that the Germans had turned into a fortified strongpoint commanding the entire beach front. British historian Robin Neal-Lands later wrote that only 52 men out of the 553 men of the Essex Scottish who landed at Dieppe returned to England safely, with the rest killed, wounded, or captured. A single regiment lost close to 90% of its strength in a single morning, the kind of loss that effectively erases a unit's fighting power outright. The Calgary Regiment's tanks fared barely better. Their tracks jammed and broke on the loose, rounded chert and shingle that made up the beach itself, terrain nobody had properly assessed before the raid was launched and terrain that simply did not behave the way planners had assumed it would based on photographs taken from a holiday camera years earlier. Only 15 of the 29 Churchill tanks that landed managed to cross the seawall, and none broke through into the town's interior, with every one of them eventually abandoned or destroyed exactly where it stalled. Royal Hamilton Light Infantry Mortarman Ken Curry described what it felt like crossing those open ramps under fire. It felt I was on the target range again. The fire was so bad. I'm down there and the bullets are bouncing off the tank end. I'm holding the base plate of my mortar and the bullets are bouncing off that and in the sand beside me. I don't know how I didn't get hit. Among the men who landed on this stretch of beach was Honorary Captain John Weir Foote, chaplain to the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. Foote repeatedly carried wounded men back to the boats under direct fire, and when the time came to evacuate, he deliberately chose to stay behind and be taken prisoner so he could remain with the men who couldn't move themselves. He earned the Victoria Cross without ever firing a shot in the entire battle. All 3 Canadian and British Victoria Cross recipients from Dieppe, Merritt, Foote, and Porteous survived the war, though Merritt and Foote each paid for it with roughly 3 years as German prisoners. The failure of the Churchill tanks at Dieppe directly shaped the specialized armor the British would build for the Normandy landings 2 years later, vehicles engineered specifically to deal with the kind of loose, unstable beach surfaces that had stopped the Calgary Regiment dead in its tracks here on White Beach. West of the main landings, at Portville, the South Saskatchewan Regiment and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada went ashore with a hidden secondary mission layered on top of the main assault: capture a German radar station and push inland toward the airfield at St. Aubin. Attached to the South Saskatchewans was Royal Air Force radar specialist Jack Nissenthal, sent ashore under direct orders that his own escort was to kill him rather than let him fall into German hands alive, and carrying a cyanide pill of his own just in case the escort wasn't fast enough to reach him first. Nissenthal reached the radar station and cut its telephone lines, forcing German operators onto radio transmissions the Allies could intercept and analyze afterward. Mountbatten later admitted that if he had known about the kill order attached to Nissenthal's mission in advance, he would have cancelled that part of the operation outright, on moral grounds alone. The South Saskatchewan's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Cecil Ingersoll, CEC Merritt, repeatedly crossed a fire-swept bridge at Portville to keep his men moving forward, walking back and forth across open ground that had already killed and wounded other men trying to cross it, reportedly calling out, "Come on over. There's nothing to worry about here." Company Sergeant Major Ed Dunkerley later put it simply, "I have never seen a braver man than Colonel Merritt that day at Portville." Merritt earned the Victoria Cross for it. Attached in support at Green Beach, the Black Watch, the Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, landed 111 men as part of the follow-up wave, and only 44 of them returned, 4 dead, 8 wounded, and 63 taken prisoner. At the western edge of the assault, near Varengeville-sur-Mer, No. 4 Commando, under Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovat, also known as Simon Fraser, carried out the only fully successful operation of the day, with Major Derek Mills Roberts serving as second in command. Their target was a 6-gun battery the British called the Hesse Battery. Planned and rehearsed with far more precision than anything attempted at the main beaches, Lovat's commandos pulled off a textbook assault, destroyed the battery, and withdrew on schedule, at a cost of roughly 45 casualties, 17 of them killed. Patrick Porteous, a captain at the time and later a major, earned the Victoria Cross for his role at Varengeville, the only British VC of the entire raid. Decades afterward, Porteous would become one of the sharpest critics of the official justification for why Dieppe had to happen at all, a contradiction worth holding onto, since the one part of the raid that actually worked is also where one of its loudest critics came from. Major General Roberts commanded the entire land battle from the deck of the destroyer HMS Kalpa, offshore, almost entirely dependent on radio relays passed up a chain of ships and signalmen, with the deputy headquarters aboard HMS Fernie standing by in support if Kalpa went down. As German fire killed radio operators on the beaches one by one, that relay chain began breaking down within the first hour of the landing, exactly the part of the operation nobody back in England had planned for. At around 7 o'clock in the morning, an ambiguous radio message suggested the Essex Scottish had broken into the town of Dieppe itself. Combined with the false, light casualties, report still sitting uncorrected from Puys, that message pushed Roberts to commit his last reserve, Les Fusiliers Mont Royal, under Lieutenant Colonel Dollard Menard, directly into what was by then a fully alerted killing zone rather than a weakening German line. Menard took a wound almost immediately after landing, before he could even confirm the picture Roberts had acted on was wrong. There's a direct parallel here to a problem modern engineers spend enormous effort solving, the single point of failure. Commercial aviation and large-scale computer networks are both built today around deliberate redundancy, multiple independent communication paths, so that one broken link can't blind an entire system to what's actually happening on the ground. Roberts had no such redundancy that morning. One relay chain was all he had, it broke under fire, and the decision that came out of that broken chain sent hundreds more Canadians into a battle that had already been lost an hour earlier. The withdrawal order went out at roughly 10:50 to 11 o'clock in the morning. By around 12:20, most of the beaches were no longer reachable by sea under the volume of German fire still pouring down from the headlands. HMS Calpe made one last attempt to pull men off the beaches around 12:48, and by 2 o'clock that afternoon, the fleet was already on its way back to England without them. From landing to retreat order, the battle itself had lasted roughly 6 hours start to finish. The full toll, across every service, was staggering once it was finally added up. Of the 6,086 men who made it ashore, 3,623 of them, nearly 60%, were killed, wounded, or captured. 907 Canadians died, 1,946 more were taken prisoner, and total Canadian casualties reached 3,367, roughly 68% of the entire Canadian force that had landed that morning. Only about 2,210 Canadians made it back to England, many of them wounded badly enough that they would never serve again. British Army losses came to 247 killed, with total British casualties approaching 300. The Royal Navy lost the destroyer HMS Berkeley and 33 landing craft, with 550 naval casualties of its own, losses that rarely make it into the standard retelling of the raid, which tends to focus almost entirely on the infantry. In the air, the Royal Air Force and Royal Canadian Air Force lost 106 aircraft, 64 Spitfires, 20 Hurricanes, 10 Mustang Mark I fighters, and 6 Bostons, the highest single-day total of aircraft the RAF lost in the entire war, including 13 RCAF aircraft specifically. 62 airmen were killed, 29 wounded, and 17 taken prisoner. German losses were a fraction of that, 591 total casualties, 311 killed and 280 wounded, plus 48 aircraft and 1 submarine chaser, UJ-1404, sunk. One British brigadier, writing in March 1943, captured a bitter internal critique of how the air battle in particular was justified afterward, describing an RAF school of thought which considers Dieppe a howling success because we were able to bring the German Air Force into the air and shoot down 200 German aircraft at the expense of 100 of our own, plus, of course, 5,000-odd good soldiers. General Lieutenant Konrad Hasse, the German commander on the ground, put the imbalance from his own side just as bluntly: it is incomprehensible that it should be believed that a single Canadian division should be able to overrun a German infantry regiment reinforced by artillery. Field Marshal von Rundstedt congratulated him in person afterward and awarded him a clasp to his Iron Cross First Class. Brigadier William Southam carried a secret copy of the full operational order ashore against direct orders. Spotted trying to bury it under beach pebbles as the fighting collapsed around him, he lost that race, and the Germans recovered the plan intact. Buried inside it were instructions to shackle German prisoners' hands during transport back to England, a routine security measure that would have consequences nobody on either side anticipated. The Germans threatened reprisal shackling of Canadian and British prisoners on September 2 and 3, 1942, then backed off. That changed after a separate British commando raid on the island of Sark on October 4, 1942, shackling of Allied prisoners began for real on October 7 and 8. Many Canadian prisoners of war spent roughly 18 months in wrist shackles as a direct result of the plan recovered on that beach months earlier. At Camp 30 in Bowmanville, Ontario, German officer-prisoners staged a 3-day uprising against a parallel shackling order imposed on them by their Canadian captors, an episode that became known as the Battle of Bowmanville. On October 18, 1942, Adolf Hitler issued his commando order, instructing the captured Allied commandos be killed outright rather than held as prisoners of war. That same month, the German High Command circulated an internal memorandum on the lessons of Dieppe for coastal defense, a document that would shape how the Atlantic Wall was built and defended for the next 2 years. Here is where the official story and the historical record start to pull apart. The standard version, repeated for decades, is that Operation Jubilee was a costly but properly authorized operation, approved through the normal chain of command, that paid for itself in lessons applied 2 years later at Normandy. The paper trail tells a Messier story. General Bernard Montgomery, who had selected the 2nd Canadian Division for the operation and helped shape the frontal assault concept behind Rudder before transferring to North Africa days before Jubilee launched, wrote in a planning report that, "The Canadians are first-class chaps, if anyone can pull it off, they will." On June 30, 1942, in a conference with Churchill, the Prime Minister asked Mountbatten directly whether he could guarantee the operation's success. Mountbatten, by Hughes Hallett's own account, admitted that he could not, and Hughes Hallett himself stepped in at that point and assured Churchill the Canadians would fight like hell. The operation went forward on the strength of that assurance, not a guarantee. Historian Robin Neil Lands put what happened next bluntly: historians have been searching for written authorization for 6 decades and failed to find any paper that gives the appropriate high-level authority for launching Jubilee. Historian Brian Loring Villa went further in his 1989 book Unauthorized Action, arguing that Mountbatten effectively relaunched the cancelled Rudder Plan as Jubilee largely on his own authority, without the formal written approval that should have come from Churchill or the Chiefs of Staff. Even historians who disagree with Villa's ultimate conclusion, such as Mike Bechtold writing in the Dorchester Review, have still praised the rigor of his underlying planning research. Hughes Hallett himself, the raid's own chief planner, later admitted plainly that the Navy had been unable to give the troops effective support. "A number of mistakes were made, chiefly by myself." This is genuinely contested ground among historians, not a settled question with one correct answer. Defenders of Mountbatten, including Terry Reardon, writing for the International Churchill Society, argue Churchill did in fact approve the revival of the raid, and that Villa's case rests too heavily on the absence of a paper trail rather than positive proof of wrongdoing. Historian David Reynolds, examining Churchill's own wartime memoirs, concluded that Churchill's published account of Dieppe ended up reflecting Mountbatten's self-serving version of events rather than the pointed questions Churchill is known to have raised privately. About the raid at the time. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, reviewing the captured Allied operational order afterward, dismissed it dryly: "The plan is in German terms not a plan, it is more a position paper or the intended course of an exercise." Montgomery himself said, years later, that the entire operation should have been cancelled for all time. Nobody has ever produced the single piece of paper that would settle, once and for all, exactly whose decision it was to send Canadian soldiers onto the beach without the air and naval bombardment the original plan had called for. There's a more recent and far more contested theory about what Dieppe was actually for. Historian David O'Keefe, after roughly 15 years of research through close to 100,000 declassified pages, has argued that Operation Jubilee provided cover for a secret intelligence mission. A small unit attached to naval intelligence, led in the field by Commander Ian Fleming, the future creator of James Bond, and a platoon under Lieutenant H.O. Huntington Whiteley concealed within No. 40 Royal Marine Commando, had orders to steal a 4-rotor Enigma machine, codebooks, and rotor setting sheets from a German naval headquarters and the Hotel Moderne in Dieppe, at 21 Rue Vauquelin. Fleming himself reportedly waited offshore aboard HMS Fernie for word of the mission's outcome. This is genuinely contested history, not settled fact. O'Keefe's theory, laid out in his book One Day in August and the documentary Dieppe Uncovered, has been embraced by some historians as finally giving the slaughter a concrete purpose beyond a failed combat experiment. Other scholars remain skeptical, unconvinced that an Enigma pinch was the operation's true driving motive rather than one secondary objective layered among many others. No consensus exists on how much weight this theory should carry against the conventional account of Dieppe as a flawed, straightforwardly conceived combat raid that simply went wrong. In Berlin, the propaganda machine moved fast. Joseph Goebbels and press chief Otto Dietrich staged photographs and ran a campaign mocking the failed raid for German and international audiences alike. Adolf Hitler personally rewarded the town of Dieppe with 10 million francs and the release of roughly 750 local French prisoners, citing the perfect discipline and calm of the town's residents during the battle, a calculated gesture aimed at occupied French opinion as much as at the men who had actually done the fighting. The German High Command, though, drew a strategic conclusion from Dieppe that would later work against them. The internal memorandum on coastal defense circulated that October concluded that a heavily fortified port, defended in depth, could reliably defeat a direct amphibious assault. That belief fed directly into German confidence in the Atlantic Wall then under construction along the French coast, confidence that the Allies would spend 2 more years deliberately working around rather than against, by avoiding exactly the kind of frontal port assault that Dieppe had seemed to prove was unbeatable. This is the claim that has defined how Dieppe gets remembered ever since. Mountbatten himself put it most directly, in the years after the war, I have no doubt that the Battle of Normandy was won on the beaches of Dieppe. For every man who died in Dieppe, at least 10 more must have been spared in Normandy in 1944. Winston Churchill backed that framing at the time, calling Jubilee a Canadian contribution, of the greatest significance to final victory, and insisting the results fully justified the heavy cost. Patrick Porteous, the man who actually earned a Victoria Cross at Dieppe, rejected that argument outright nearly 50 years later. Absolute nonsense. We could have learned as much in Weymouth Bay. The specific lessons usually credited to Dieppe are real ones, not invented after the fact to justify the losses. Allied planners decided never to assault a heavily defended port head-on again, and they developed artificial mulberry harbors specifically to land supplies and reinforcements over open beaches instead of fighting for an intact one. Specialized armor came next, built to handle exactly the kind of loose shingle that had stopped the Calgary Regiment's tanks cold on White Beach, along with tighter integration between tactical air support and ground troops than anything that existed during Jubilee. A 2012 U.S. Army study, though, pushed back hard on how much credit Dieppe actually deserves for any of it, arguing that Overlord's eventual success in Normandy owed far more to sheer scale, the Fortitude deception campaign that misdirected German reserves away from the real landing beaches, and hard operational experience the Allies had already gained independently in Sicily and Italy long before D-Day. Both positions are argued today by serious historians, using exactly the same set of facts. Neither side has produced anything close to a knockout piece of evidence that settles the question for good. The Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery sits at Haut-sur-Mer, a few kilometers south of the town itself. 948 Commonwealth servicemen lie buried or commemorated there, according to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, 187 of them never identified, alongside a small number of non-Commonwealth and non-Second World War burials. Even official sources don't fully agree on exactly how many of those graves are specifically Canadian, with counts ranging from roughly 580 to over 700 depending on which government or memorial database gets consulted. The occupying Germans actually laid out the cemetery during the war, and after liberation, architect Philip Hepworth redesigned the site while preserving its unusual back-to-back double row of headstones, completing the work in 1949. Canadian Army missing with no known grave are commemorated at the Brookwood Memorial in England, and Royal Canadian Air Force missing at the Runnymede Memorial nearby. Regimental memorials now stand at Puys, Pourville, and along the Dieppe seafront itself, alongside the Dieppe Canada Monument in the town's Square du Canada. The town of Dieppe, New Brunswick, named in honor of the raid generations after that earlier history of ships sailing from the French Dieppe to populate New France, maintains ongoing cultural exchanges with Dieppe, France, to this day. In Canada, sites like Windsor's Dieppe Gardens carry the name and the memory on the home front, far from any beach. By the 80th anniversary in 2022, Canadian veterans who had actually fought there, men like Gordon Fennell of the Calgary Tanks, then roughly 100 years old, were among the very last who could still attend in person. The Juno Beach Center marked the anniversary with an exhibition titled From Dieppe to Juno and a postcard project that mailed commemorative cards to the former home addresses of soldiers who never came back to claim them, while a separate exhibition opened that same year in Hamilton, Ontario. Ceremonies like the one at Windsor's Dieppe Gardens, by the 82nd anniversary in 2024, were already being described as among the last that any actual veteran of the European theater would live to attend in person. The CBC's 1993 miniseries Dieppe, Drawn directly from Brian Loring-Villa's research, and the 2012 documentary Dieppe Uncovered, built around David O'Keefe's Enigma thesis, remain the two biggest attempts to bring the raid's unresolved questions to a wider audience outside the history books. Nearly 5,000 Canadians crossed the Channel on the night of August 18, 1942, to take a port for a single tide. Within 6 hours, most of them were dead, wounded, or in German hands, and more than 80 years later, no historian has ever produced the document that proves who, with full authority, decided that risk was worth taking. Mountbatten called it the price of Normandy, and Porteous called it a lie. Both men were there, and both of them believed exactly what they said. The question Dieppe actually leaves behind isn't whether the men who fought there were brave, since every account, German and Canadian alike, agrees they were. The real question is whether anyone with the authority to stop it ever truly weighed what it would cost against what it might teach. 84 years on, that question still sits unanswered, and nothing uncovered since has come close to settling it.